Good afternoon, dear friends. Welcome to our webinar of UK-Russian Collaborations webinar series. Today is our sixth webinar, which is called After the Field, Maintaining Connections. This is the third webinar of our small series covering the field studies before the field, during the field, and after the field. This session is being recorded, and the video will be posted then online. The attendees of the sessions are automatically muted except the speakers. So please keep your microphones muted while other speaker is communicating. To keep the discussion in ethical manner, we kindly ask you to use the EPICS Code of Conduct. The session is performed in English with the simultaneous interpretation in Russian, so you can choose the appropriate channel in the lower bar side on the right by clicking the option Interpretation. All right, let's start. Today we have the speakers, which is Ben Boyes and Yulia Zayka. My name is Alexey Kishangov. I also participate in the discussion. So let's go straight to the first question of our discussion. So actually, how to continue cooperation after the field? What should we do? So Ben, could you please start the discussion?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Alexey. So I suppose really the first sort of thing is to say that once we've finished in the field, there's still a lot to be done. So within the science project that you were doing in the field, you could be writing a scientific paper, for argument's sake, continue with your analysis of your results. There's always plenty of science within that initial project to do. And that's sort of the short-term aims of after the field. But in the long term, I think it's quite important that we keep our collaborations going. Science today is quite often transient, so it's really short-lived in our projects, and we sort of tend to abandon projects almost before they're finished and start something new. But in doing that, I think we lose quite a lot of science or a lot of possible results that we could have. So surely it's better that we try and continue developing knowledge either with a project that we've just started or continuing our collaboration so that we can build and develop our knowledge further in any specific field that we might be researching. And I think that's also quite important. And if you ever want to do any other projects in the future, by maintaining collaborations, it makes starting and establishing a new project much easier than trying to have to start a brand new collaboration all over again, which can take several years.
Yes, thank you very much for this point of view. Yes, we need to continue our communication, our studies, writing publications to stay connected. Yulia, can you maybe say something from your experience?
Thank you
very much, Alexey. Thank you, Ben. Well, I tend to agree with Ben. Many projects are transient. On the other hand, well, I can say that I have some experience, though we are still young scientists. I have a kind of an example of great relationships of our senior colleagues who are in collaboration and jointly write projects and articles, and sometimes this has been going on for 30 years. So the station where I work, we have received Professor Dr. Gert Reith from the UK, and he's been coming to us since 1990, and this is still going on, and I believe that this is really important to maintain this long-term connections, because they further develop into friendships, which is really important to maintain this friendship. And I believe that this is the foundation for further successful scientific cooperation.
Yes, thank you, Yulia, very much. I also can say something from my own personal experience. Yeah, when I had a field expedition with a foreign institution, it was possible for me. It was a great pleasure for me that we could set a great relationship, which we could continue afterwards, staying connected using emails, sharing our knowledge. And we actually had an opportunity to publish a collective paper. So I understand this even from my own personal experience, that staying connected after field is possible, and it is actually needed for future for international collaboration. Also, yes, Yulia?
Я просто хотела добавить, что
a brief addition from my side. My colleague and good friend from the US once said that if we have partners, we have friends, we'll find things to do in science.
We should keep our connections, because some scientific questions may arise in future, and by that moment we will already have people, colleagues for work. So we won't be lonely when we will have some scientific work to do. Also, the problem which touched everybody in the world is the pandemic, COVID-19. And of course, it touched the scientific sphere, the international connection. We had to face some challenges of these conditions of working online, having few or no meetings, in-person meetings at all. Either Yulia or Ben, could you share some of your experience of staying connected with the international colleagues during this hard time?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it posed a big challenge for me. I was meant to be on fieldwork in summer 2020. Understandably, that got cancelled. But my colleagues in Russia were still able to go on fieldwork. And I think that sort of is quite useful, because it means that while international travel was stopped, local scientists can still continue the work, and therefore you can still gather results or data and analyze these after the field together. You can still continue to do other scientific work if you wanted. It could be writing papers or just generally having meetings as well like this. It's quite important to keep communicating like this so that we maintain connections and we can just keep coming up with new ideas about science and where we might want to go in the future, how we might adapt to challenges like COVID.
Yeah, thank you. It's great that it was possible to continue your work in this difficult time. Yulia, would you add anything from your experience?
Спасибо за вопрос. Да,
Thank you very much for the question. I can say that I'm part of the Interact project for more than 10 years now, and we'll mention Interact again. It's really important that one of the ways of maintaining science in Interact is through remote access. And the goal is that, well, it was developed before the pandemic, by the way. So if the scientists for some reason cannot come to the location where the field work is planned, where they need to run the experiments, they can get in touch with the local scientists and they can ask the local scientists, share with them the research protocol, tell them how to perform it, how to take samples, and they can ask them to do the job which has to be done for their research. And I believe that despite the fact that we are still in touch and we have personal relationships, so we can see that the scientific community is further developing, and we find new opportunities and ways to perform the field work irrespective of the prior knowledge of each other. So I believe that within this remote work tools, we can find new partners and friends.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your experience. And I also can say that in scientific sphere, not only actual scientific work is necessary, like writing papers or dealing with samples or something like that, but also meetings, in-person meetings like conferences, workshops. We had everything of this before the pandemic. We were used to it, but after that, during the pandemic, we lost this chance of live communication. What do you think? Will we again have chance of frequent meetings, live communications on different events, or will we also have more online communication? And do you think if the live communication is more important for keeping contacts, for staying in touch, and if so, how will it influence our cooperation in future? What are your thoughts? Can you say something about this?
I think online communication like this is here to stay. As much as I like meeting in person, and as good as it is, online communication, whether that be via email or conference platforms like this is so much easier than having to fly halfway around the world just to have a conversation. Whereas now we can just pick up the phone and talk on a platform like this. And I think this is also quite a good way for us to be able to maintain those connections. If we were restricted to just meeting at conferences, they happen once, twice a year, say, whereas this, we can communicate every week if we wanted. So that means, I suppose, that we can develop our science a lot faster than we normally would do.
Yes, of course. Of course, online communication is it helps us very much. Of course, it saves time very well, and I'm sure that this is the very important lesson that we learned during the pandemic. That remote communication is possible, and it plays a very important role in maintaining connections. Although, of course, I think nobody will disagree that in-person communications are also highly necessary. For making connections. Yulia, maybe you could add anything about this?
Спасибо большое. Очень важный.
Thank you very much. That's a really important issue. I believe that it's more kind of existential. And I agree with Ben. He's saying that the world is developing, moving ahead. And the online communications will progress as well. I believe, well, firstly, that this reduces the carbon footprint. We've been discussing quite extensively through our climate change interactions, and it lets the remote communities, sometimes hard to reach, and we have quite a lot of them throughout the Arctic, if you talk about the Arctic research, and in other places as well. So if telecoms further develop, we'll be able to reach these remote places which need research and science.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your thoughts. So, yeah, of course, this question of staying connected after the field is very important. I think we have covered some important aspects of this. So maybe any other thoughts that can be added to this topic from any of you, or should we summarize all our other webinars? So should we go further, or if anybody has something else to say, you're welcome.
I think maybe I'll just finish off by saying that if anyone is unsure about how to maintain collaborations, there are several quite long-lasting projects out there. So Yulia mentioned Gareth Rees from Cambridge University. That's an excellent project that's been going for several decades now. So if you are unsure about how to maintain connections, I'm sure that if you got in touch with these long-lasting collaborations, they will happily share their knowledge and some tips about how you can maintain your connections in the long term.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Yulia, if you can say anything, please, you're welcome.
Я, спасибо большое.
Thank you very
Очень
much.
действительно очень интересный вопрос. И
This is quite interesting question, and the topic of the webinar is quite exciting. How to maintain connections. You know, some time ago, I worked with some indigenous peoples, and they always complained that scientists would come, ask questions, would deal with them, they go and are lost for them. And this is strange. So if within the community we cannot maintain connections following the short-term projects, we are even in a worse shape maintaining connections with those we deal with. So I believe these issues are important, and they should be raised not only for the scientific community, but also for the people we do the research for as scientists. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Very important aspect you touched in your talk. All right, so we have finished the 3 webinars which covered the field studies. We had some communication about preparing for field, participating in field studies, and maintaining connections after the field. But also we have finished our entire webinar series. And I think during the last hour meeting, we can summarize everything that we discussed during this series. So the first webinar which we had was why collaboration is important. Why should we at all start doing something? Why should we find connections? I would like to start from myself. At first, what I understand from international collaboration, it is interesting for me for developing my scientific careers, my knowledge, my skills. It also improves the the communication skills. It helps to understand other cultures. So it is more than just working in your research sphere. So Ben and Julia, can you add something about why collaboration is important?
Yeah, of course. Collaborations are, well, as we all say, quite important, but I think the reasons why are quite interesting. Really, if we talk about science, one of the things that we try and do is communicate our knowledge. But the transfer of knowledge historically has been quite difficult across language barriers. So by having collaborations, we can start to share scientific knowledge that would not have been shared otherwise. I think that's really quite important if we want to, in the sphere of climate change, say, actually truly and fully understand the implications of climate change on today and in the future. We need to actually share knowledge across the world so that we have more data available to be able to make more informed decisions and interpretations. But also, I suppose, along the lines of what we've been talking about today and last week, collaborations are really important for access to field sites. I know from my perspective, I would not have been on field work if it had not been for a collaboration that I had established. I think that's really all I've got to say on why collaborations are quite important for transferring knowledge and for access to fieldwork.
Yes, thank you very much. It is a very important point. It helps to develop opportunities, which are important for scientists. Yulia, anything else to add?
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much. Indeed, collaboration is important. Throughout our webinar series, we have touched upon really important things, which are not only the field of bilateral cooperation between Russia and the UK, but they're also important for overall international cooperation. And I have talked about the International Polar Year experience. And the next year of this kind will be in 2032, 2033. So this is coming. And I believe that this year's will be pretty quick in passing. The association we all belong to, it comes from the International Polar Year. So I'm talking about our participation in the APEX. So we are the young scientists developing science, international collaboration, and we need to be more focused on the indigenous people, and we discuss interdisciplinary projects. This is all important. And all that has been developed and promoted throughout the previous Polar Year discussions, 2007, 2008. And I believe that looking back at the results of the previous International Polar Year, we can say that the next one will be much better prepared and more responsible in terms of many things, like science. And I agree with Ben and with you. I'd like to say that international cooperation sheds light on the culture of other people, and you start understanding how the scientific dialogue and knowledge exchange is important. And you also get a chance to participate in the interdisciplinary work. This is really important because we should have a holistic view of the world to understand the changes going on. So maybe I a little bit deviated from the initial question. Sorry for that.
Thank you very much. It is necessary to develop the topic. This is why we are discussing here. This is the purpose of our discussions, to cover as much as possible. So thank you very much for your talks. And so the next webinar which we had was about funding opportunities, some networks which can help support. And one of the important opportunities is using the Interact network. And I kindly ask Yulia to briefly explain her own experience of working with Interact.
Спасибо большое, Алексей.
Thank you very much, Alexei. I can briefly share with you my experience of working with Interact, where I worked there as a station manager. And maybe Ben can share his experience as the group leader of the scientists who come to the station to perform their research. Interact, and we've talked about it, this is a big Psychomarctic station. We have about 85 stations there, I believe, in the Arctic, in Russia, and in the European regions of the Arctic. Interact is important since, from the managerial point of view, we can exchange there our experience of how we do research logistics, how we organized the field work and research work at stations in various parts of the Arctic. Since in many cases we exist and work in one environmental area in the Arctic, and we understand each other, we understand the risks of the work like that and how they can be mitigated and planned. So we can share these discussions and issues through Interact. And it's important from the management point of view, because otherwise it's not always clear how you should behave in a given situation. And today, Interact, it's there for more than 10 years, by the way. Within this time, it has developed a huge base, and a lot of resources are there to help the scientists to come, so we can pay for their access to the Arctic and to other remote and hard-to-reach places. And this brings, as we have discussed, a chance to obtain information on where and how you can prepare for a mission to a given station, what you should add to the plan of your field work, and so on and so forth. So I believe that this is a crucial resource.
Thank you very much. And Ben, you also used Interact in your field research, didn't you?
I did, yeah. And very much going to repeat what Yulia says. It is a fantastic network of stations available. It's nice and easy to apply to, and they have done a lot of work on preparing the logistical background for your fieldwork by having, for example, where I work, the field station available. It was really easy for me to be able to book travel there. Yulia would help with that. Local scientists would be able to be put in touch with them as well to be able to make your work a lot easier. If anyone's ever considering fieldwork in the Arctic, I really would recommend looking at Interact as a way of sourcing funding, but also just looking at their field stations, because they're very well distributed across the Arctic region and in some really exciting locations for whatever science you might be interested in doing.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that our listeners, it is a very important information for listeners of our webinar. And I hope that some of them will be able to use these opportunities which you have just described. So let's move forward. Our next webinar was about language issues. When we work with international colleagues, we have different native languages, and sometimes it is a problem to find common way of communication. As I understand that this problem exists in some Russian institutions. Yeah, and it's quite it's quite difficult for foreigners coming to Russia to start communicate effectively with their Russian colleagues. And at this point, I remember the experience which Ben described when coming to Russia. At first it was difficult, and then it went somehow easier. Wasn't it so, Ben? Could you briefly just repeat it for our listeners?
Yeah, of course. So when I first went on fieldwork, I didn't speak any Russian at all. Just a simple hello, how are you, and that was about it. I wasn't as gifted as Yulia or Alexei, who can speak both languages, but my field colleagues could also, they were lucky enough to be able to speak a bit of English, so we managed to get by. And over a course of about 5 weeks, I would pick up some of the Russian language, they would pick up some of the English language, and we could communicate in our own way about science. But during the course of that webinar, we heard from Yevgeny Zarov from Yugra State University, and he highlighted from his, I think it was INSACAR project, the interesting network they've set up where they actually teach their postgraduate students Russian or English languages. And I think that's quite important if we have these big projects set up, that we try and invest in foreign language skills so that it helps not only that project, but projects in the future.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, language is very important. From my personal experience, I can say that when I came to Norway, when I collaborated with Norwegian researchers, I didn't experience this problem at all. Yes, it's great that in some countries, knowing English is enough for communication, both formal communication and informal communication. Yeah, I hope that someday in Russia it will be the same situation. Yulia, maybe you can share some your experience concerning the language in communicating with foreign colleagues.
Это очень хороший вопрос. Спасибо большое.
That's a very good question. When you talked to Ben, I thought that from the scientific point of view, we have a kind of a language barrier issue here. Let's call it this way. So, you, Ben, and you, Alexei, you are from the science field, I would say. And in the field, it's pretty tricky when you come from the social science. It's pretty difficult to interview the local communities, the indigenous peoples. So this is an issue. And I mean, the language as a barrier in this case. And this is not only in the interpersonal communications. I believe that the scientific community as a whole is now using English as an international language. And most of my fellow scientists from various countries, they communicate in English, and it doesn't bring any issues. But in the field, when you have some social research, you deal with the local people, with indigenous people, issues might arise. And this is not only interpersonal, but also scientific. So I believe that we did a good thing in discussing this in our webinar. And as Ben rightly mentioned, the Guinness project, so what they are introducing at the university is a really interesting thing, an interesting way to overcome this language barrier. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And yeah, let's move forward. Then we started our small series of field-related webinars. And the first one was before the field. What should we do to effectively prepare to the field studies? Yeah, everybody understands that numerous documents are necessary, and it may become a great challenge to cope with this problem, to collect all the documents together, and finally to be able to start the field studies. We have learned that some help can be done by the Interact research network. We also learned experience from the Chukotka region, where some help is done for foreigners who come for some field studies for Chukotka region. And I remember that Ben, during his talk on one of the webinars, told that it took him a while to collect the necessary documentation to prepare for fieldwork in Russia. Could you briefly just comment this, Ben?
Yeah, of course. So my particular problem was trying to export geological samples from Russia to the UK. And I think this is a problem that a lot of science has in the Arctic, not just in Russia, but is trying to get permits. They take a very long time to apply for permits, to receive your permits. So for me, it took over a year to get our scientific permits to export samples from Russia to the UK. And that slows down your project quite a lot. So I think one thing that we learned in this webinar was from Svenja Holster from Apex about a resource on the Interact website that discusses all of the regulations in the various Arctic countries. I've already sort of mentioned I really like this resource, and I really will keep recommending it. Do have a look at this website. It will tell you all the different obstacles that you might encounter, all the different regulations, what permits you might need, and so on for whatever region of the Arctic you're wanting to work in. And that will help you plan your field work. So in the case of UK, Russia scientific work, you really do need to have a collaboration so that you can work successfully and acquire your permits. There's no way that from a UK institution I could get permits for working in Russia without having my Russian collaborators.
Yeah, thank you very much. From your experience of international collaboration.
Спасибо, Алексей. Мы уже несколько
Thank you,
раз
Alexei. We have mentioned Interact a number of times, and this is not just because we want to promote it. This is indeed a very useful project and a very useful resource. I'd like to mention that globally speaking and comprehensively assessing our webinars, we can say that many interesting issues have been raised. For instance, sometimes, and quite often, you don't have proper communication between the scientists and the station management team. Quite often, the station managers, they are not scientists. They are there to primarily maintain the station's performance throughout the year or any other scenario. And scientists, and not only scientists, well, these two groups can have a hard time trying to establish a dialogue, and this is really important. Interact is trying to establish this dialogue, and even if you come outside of Interact, you should get in touch with the station management and with some other organizations. For instance, in Chukotka, they don't have a station, but this person is head of a logistics organization, which does scientific logistics. And this is really important, since in the Arctic, we have a forum of Arctic research operators. So these are the people who do the Arctic logistics, and they have their own platform to discuss important issues. That's why I believe that we need a kind of a comprehensive and multilateral dialogue. If you want to be successful in your research and your field work to be successful, you should be in touch and with all the parties, with management, with the scientists and the local communities and so on.
Yes, thank you very much. Let's move forward. After dealing with bureaucratic issues, after dealing with documents, we finally start the field studies, and this is the great experience which Arctic researchers should have for our research. From my experience, I explained some features of participating in marine expedition. What should be kept in mind while staying on board, which operations are conducted, why it is necessary to have good communication with people around you. It is particularly important staying on the ship because it is an isolated space, and if you make some conflicts with people, you have nowhere to go. You just have to be friendly with everybody. It is necessary both for your productive scientific research and for your well-being on board, just for your good conditions of your staying on board. Yeah, and Ben mentioned some features of terrestrial expedition. Ben, could you please just briefly summarize what are the most important things of having a productive expedition with international colleagues?
Yeah, of course. I think during that webinar, the one message I put across and I always sort of mention is communication. Communication is really important if science is going to be successful. So whether that be in planning your fieldwork, make sure you clearly communicate across all parties what you want to do. So like Julia mentioned earlier, communicating with your scientific station manager so they know what logistical needs you have, but also communicating with your collaborating science team, what it is that you want to do. Also, you need to know what they want to do. So therefore you plan something that is in keeping with everyone's goals and aims from their various scientific backgrounds. And I think that, yeah, that also the communication aspect, as we sort of mentioned earlier, then also leads on after the field as well, is how to we need to keep communicating after the field so that we can maintain our collaboration and keep the project that we are working on going, so that we can analyze data properly, so that we can publish data or whatever our challenges or tasks may be.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, good points covered in your talk. So let's move forward, and our last webinar, which is today, it's about staying in contact with our colleagues after the field studies. And this is what we discussed today in the beginning of the webinar. And this is what Ben just mentioned in his last talk. We should not finish our work in the field. We should continue remote connections with our colleagues and to finalize our work, to publish papers, and to plan further work and so on. Yes, Yulia, please, could you please tell your point?
Спасибо, Алексей.
Thank you, Alexei. I'd like to add on the previous point. I believe that we touched upon risks and risks planning. It's really difficult to predict unpredictable risks, but it was really interesting to hear your experience of land and sea expeditions. And one thing which wasn't really raised was about risks when we do the field work in various seasons. I mean, we get used to the fact that in the Arctic, the summer is short, and usually that's when we do our research. But going back to my experience of the station where I worked with groups of scientists, we sometimes had periods when we planned the field work in winter, which is tricky. And for instance, avalanche risks somewhere at the mountains. Well, indeed, there are some pretty dangerous places there. And in the summer, well, you can get lost in the Arctic, in the forest, for instance. So I believe that this is a really comprehensive issue, and we should build a risk plan, so to plan risks as much as we can. And sure, we cannot assess or plan all the risks, but we need to get ready for this. So I would say that the Arctic is quite a harsh and difficult environment. The webinar we've had today, I believe we have exhausted the topic. It's really important to maintain communications in the long run, as Ben has mentioned. And I believe that this gives you a view of the world, and it lets you study the world from various perspectives. And so these interpersonal communications, the long ones in the scientific field, are really important for this.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we had a productive discussion, both about our last topic, maintaining connections after the field, and of course, summarizing all the webinars which we had during our series. I think on this at this moment, I would like to thank our today's speakers, which were Yulia and Ben. And I also tried to contribute to our discussion. Thank you very much. Our series is over. I would like to mention that soon we will have all our webinar published on our YouTube channel in both languages, in Russian and English. So please stay tuned and use these webinars in future for planning your research, for planning international collaboration. And we hope it would be productive for you, and the webinar were useful for all of us. I think it is time to finish. And of course, we are very grateful to our partners, to our funders, and to speakers which had talks during all our webinars. And of course, special thanks to our listeners who attended our webinars. as I told, we hope that the webinars were useful for you. If anybody can add something, please, you are welcome. And if not, let us just finish on this point. Yeah, once again, thank you very much, all of you. And yeah, goodbye.
Thank you, Alexei.
Staying in contact with all of you in future. Goodbye.